Well, we've heard a lot of great comments about land-grant universities so far today, and a lot of wisdom from many people. And what I'd like to do is to take a show of hands here. How many of you in here are first-generation college graduates? Look at that. So was I. And so, just like you, I owe a significant debt of gratitude to North Dakota State University and land-grant universities in general. I had got my bachelor's and master's here in the 1960s. In fact, I was having dinner with Roald, and I remember taking my first agronomy class from you, Roald, in about 1966. And then I had an opportunity to serve in several roles at North Dakota State Universities, about 5 years, I think, and looking at coal impact assessments. And then I went on and did my PhD, and I came back for an 8-year run here. And I had so much fun as a farm management economist. Roald, I can't even believe you paid me, actually. I mean, it was really a lot of fun, and I felt, but it really touched my heart because we were having a significant impact on farm families, not only helping them with technology, but in terms of the farm crisis in the 1980s, we made a huge difference in families. I must have been, out of my mind there for a while. I left the state 23 years ago, and I've had an opportunity to serve in 2 other great systems. I've had 2 runs at University of Wisconsin, and I was also dean and director in Wisconsin, and director of the extension service in Michigan. So those are the 2 systems that Tom Eisern talked about this morning, the 2 different models. And those were also great opportunities. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm doing here in a little bit. But what I want to do in the short time I have here is to talk about 3 forms of capital and the contributions that land-grant universities have made to each of these. So I want to talk a little bit about human capital, economic capital, and environmental capital. And what I'm going to do is to provide a short historical context and then talk about some of the opportunities. And it's very interesting. Some of the opportunities, as you wouldn't be surprised, have already been talked about today. So I'll give a little credit to some of those. But I had them on my mind, too. So when we think of the word capital, we often think of business or financial investments. But capital is far more than that. Capital can come in many different forms. And the 3 I'm talking about are just those 3. We could be talking about political capital. We could be talking about social capital. But a capital is anything that can either be used, invested, or swapped in exchange for to create value. So it's very significant, the concept of value. I want to talk about human capital. And President Piscani, you stole one of my lines, so I'm going to just augment it just a little bit. It absolutely starts with human capital. That is so fundamental. Nothing else will happen in a country that's really great unless we develop human capital. And remember just a few years ago, about half a dozen years ago, Jim Collins came out with his Good to Great book, and he talked about the concept of hedgehogs and what you could be the best in the world at. And you know what South Korea has as their hedgehog? Human capital. They said, we're going to compete on the basis of human capital. And you talked earlier, President, about the $4 billion that South Korea is putting in there. So the importance of human capital, I'm going to be making a pitch here. Our nation is outstanding and great, and we can continue to be great, but not unless we make significant investments in our human capital. In terms of historical context, the land-grant universities have so much to do about benefiting this nation and the standard of living and the quality of life we have as we transformed the economy from the 1862 period, the early industrial age, all the way up to the information and global age that we live in today. So probably enough said on that since time is short. But I want to talk about now some future opportunities for land-grant universities. I think we start, and Doug will talk more about this because he's a great extension background. I think it starts with the entrepreneurial spirit in our kids. And I think one of the reasons this nation has been so good, we've been very entrepreneurial. And we still have I believe, somewhat of a competitive advantage over most nations in that area. That's a big deal. We need to keep that, that competitive spirit and the entrepreneurial, particularly the entrepreneurial spirit going. We heard from a number of people today the value of STEM. And as it relates to agriculture, there's no question. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, huge deal. There's no question about it. And we're going to have to be flexible over time because we're not even sure 20 years out some of the professions that we'll have to be training for. If you look back 20 years, some of the things we need to train for now weren't even here. Right, Doug? I mean, it's amazing, the changes. But the pitch I want to make to you is Jackie talked a little bit about. One of the things that we must do in this country is we've got to teach the soft skills to go along with the technical skills. In all my runs in administration, only a few times have I made a hiring decision where the person could not do the job because they couldn't learn the technical skills. And those of you in administration, you're not surprised at all. It's always the interpersonal pieces. We need, in university settings, to teach the soft skills. And I do that now for the experiment stations and for land-grant universities in general. But I teach some of the skills that we describe as emotional intelligence. I teach people, for example, how to listen. Senior executives, in about a half a day, I can do that. And it transforms them if they want to be transformed. Amazing. For example, if you're going to mentor a new person, you have to suspend evaluative and discerning listening and practice empathic and comprehensive listening. So you should listen for different purposes. Almost all scientists are taught to be discerning and evaluative listeners. And so listening is a big deal. I want to talk about some other skill sets. In the collaboration training that I do across the country, and I often have some very successful scientists and a few people from the private sector helping me with this, but we take people through the collaboration steps. How do you build collaborations? It's one thing to just talk about it, but how do you build them? Successful collaborations are built on joint work products, but you can't do it unless you know how to do interest-based negotiating, dialogue meetings, building trust, and the damage that prima donnas can do to a team. And leadership. Leadership is extremely important. In the research I did on my book on high-performing teams from some of the best from all over the world, including the Tiger teams, which were the first to map the human genome, not once did we find a high-performing team report directly to a command and control leader. You just won't have it happen. We did deal with some very command and control companies, but there's always an insulating layer where there's an executive that's protecting that high-performing team if it's very command and control. So very, very significant, the role of trust and the soft skills. I just can't emphasize it enough. In fact, a very solid base of research now shows up to 60% of success comes from emotional intelligence. All else equal, about 60% across all jobs. And we don't teach those skill sets, and that's very, very important. Also want to talk about a couple other areas. I think one is very controversial. I am really worried, not for me, not for my kids, but for my grandkids. I'm very worried about the very low high school graduation rates. And in the United States, we've got to take that on. And there's no better institution to do it than land-grant universities. Others should join in. I'm not assigning any blame here, but low graduation rates are a disaster. Because if you do not even have a high school degree in a global society, what kind of a job do you have? If you can't read by 5th grade, the correlation to being in prison by the time you're a high school senior is very direct. And so we need to put significant resources in that area, or the nation would be in danger in going into second world status. It's that serious. So we need to tackle that one and not avoid it, because I think Ken was saying earlier today that a lot of the relatively easy issues have been solved, and that's so that is one I wanted to mention. Lifelong education is going to be important, and we'll have to be flexible and nimble over time. And developing the human capital isn't going to be inexpensive. And what the deal is here, if land-grant universities continue to deliver high-quality education and deliver what I'll be calling in a minute economic and environmental capital. And if you do it really well, you'll also have the political capital from your legislators, but you've got to be good. You've got to earn it. And that's why political capital is also important. I don't have time to get into that one, but all of that's very important. You do need to make investments, and North Dakota's in a position to do that, and you do have one of the most wonderful systems in the United States. I want to move on to economic capital now. In a broad sense, economic capital is about financial and technical development. And I want to talk a little bit about a historical context. I'm a North Dakota farm boy, and I grew up on a grain and livestock farm out west. And my grandfather, in fact, all the grandfathers on my wife's side and my side came from Norway. So I'm one of those wild Vikings, which is either good or bad. My mom said I couldn't talk about being Norwegian because she always said that would be bragging. And so I got it in there, though, anyway, didn't I? Anyway, my grandfather, he died in 1961. I was 12 years old, and I spent a lot of time with him. He was a dear man, loved him dearly, and I spent time with him in the nursing home. And he had all these chaps with him, and you know what they talked about? They talked about the dirty 30s, and I couldn't even tell you some of the stories that my grandpa told. They're not repeatable, but he didn't like the dirty 30s much. But one of the things he said is, well, that was a nature thing. It didn't rain, and we're farmers after all, and they all said that, we wouldn't be farmers if we didn't take risk and so on, and we knew that someday it was going to rain again. But that darn rust crisis, that scared us to death. And that old North Dakota Ag College saved our bacon. And they were having that conversation while they were having coffee. And I'm thinking, gosh, we should have had the NDSU Foundation there in those days collecting money from some of those folks, because they said their whole livelihood was indebted to North Dakota Ag College. And the rust crisis, Ken, you know more about this than I do, but it repeats. I think there was one year in the 30s that it rained. And I know my grandfather on my wife's side, he had gotten some wheat out of Canada, and his neighbors would come from all over, and he felt bad because he had a crop, and theirs was all gone. So in the 50s, Neil, you were telling me what, the durum crop was shot. So that's a very fascinating story. And then we repeated it, and we did interesting things in the 1980s. We worked with over 3,000 farm families, one-on-one, helping them with the farm crisis. That was NDSU stepping up in a big way. And we brought in a lot of the soft skills there, because when farm families are falling apart like that, you had to have training in the human skills first, because that was really not an easy task. And I was directly involved in that myself. In the 1960s, for example, on my home farm, this is another technological example, we raised small grains. And now we grow pulse crops in rotation, things like lentils and chickpeas, and we're pretty successful at it. And we used to leave half the land idle. Now that's all due to NDSU in collaboration with the private sector and farmers themselves. So Doug and Ken can talk more about that. Some future opportunities in the environmental capital area. I think they're almost unlimited. We've already heard speakers talk about 9 billion people. I think it'll be about 2040 when that happens, rather than 2050. But it doesn't really matter. It's a lot of people. And so the technological advancements that we're going to have to make here are absolutely incredible. It'll take more collaborations and partnerships to be successful. Clearly technology, but a new way of doing business. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the collaborations we have with other countries that are relatively unique, a new way of doing business for the future. I think North Dakota in particular has an opportunity to help the nation in many ways. You're doing it in renewable energy, to many energy crops. Ken, we got a new one, Nebraska Carinata. We're just experimenting. Jay has that up at Minot and other places. You brought many new crops in, but we think that has some potential, and that's why we have universities to advance crops like that could result in jet fuel and biojet fuel. But we also have an opportunity in fossil fuels to repower America's manufacturing base with natural gas. We can do it if we had the political will to do it, and if we wanted to do it, it could make a huge difference as a transition to other technologies. If I had my way, I'd do fourth-generation nuclear too, but that's very controversial. But I really think it would make a difference, particularly in the carbon dioxide that we put in the air. So a lot of opportunities in this area. I want to move now to environmental capital. And I'll be very brief here. I want to talk about soil and water. And again, I want to take you back in a historical context. This time, I'm the old buzzard, 1961. We had a crop failure. It was so dry. My grandpa said that even the clouds were just the empties coming back. It didn't rain all summer. We had grasshoppers. You talked about grasshoppers. Man, we had grasshoppers. And we didn't pull the combine out at all. And my grandfather, shortly before he died, he said, I think this is worse than any single year in the 1930s. Clouds of dust and tumbleweeds, and you had the same problem with dust in the house, and it was just a ugly sight. People were not so happy, and I certainly remember the reaction that my mom had to that year. It was really hard. But now, thanks to NDSU, in collaboration with other entities and farmers, we've gone to no-till. I've not seen any soil move since we went to no-till. We no-till the whole operation, and we owe that to the land-grant universities. Now, every one of you in here could tell a story like that, those of you particularly that have been involved directly in farming. Some of the future opportunities here I see are almost unlimited, but I think many of them are going to have to do with high-tech applications for farming that will conserve natural resources, reduce environmental impacts, reduce financial risk, and increase profits. Some of those technologies are linked to GPS and really site-specific farming. And I'll talk about one of those collaborations that I'm working with John Deere on right now, but it has to do with adjusting inputs for topography, soil productivity, water infiltration rates, and much more, all at the same time. Another area, and several speakers have talked about this, environmental stewardship. Water will be the most limiting input of all the inputs in the next 30 years. Water will be our most precious resource, and there will be opportunities for a lot more research for water conservation and efficiency use. And the last one I want to talk about is adapting agriculture to increased weather variability. This is a big deal. And there's in the Plains states, and what I want to talk about here, Ken, is a collaboration you hosted. Doug, Gary, you were here. Neil Fisher was at that session, and what we did is we hosted here in Fargo the prairie provinces from Canada and the deans and directors from the prairie states. We gathered here and we talked about what can we do. And a lot's happened since then. For example, putting collaborations together is not easy, but we have had some great success, and it started here under your leadership, Ken, in the meeting in September of 2009. We had meetings in Winnipeg, we had a big meeting in Kansas City, and out of the Kansas City meeting came the idea for a huge project that ended up being the #1 large, they call them CAP grants in USDA within NEFA. We ended up with a $25 million CAP grant to deal with wheat and barley and both heat and drought tolerance. And there's two kinds of errors you can have. Let's say we make this investment as a society, and weather variability decreases or goes away. What's the kind of error you have? Just got better germplasm, great crops, better crops. On the other hand, if many of the people that are looking at climate change in a major way are right, and we have at least a 15% drag in our yields over a 15-year period, if we don't make that kind of an investment, then we're in trouble. And it's a food security issue. And Neil, I don't know, what, 40% of the world's exports come from the prairie provinces, something like that, and the wheat exports, you're the wheat wizard about that, isn't it? Close enough. I'm an economist. So it's a significant factor. So putting collaborations together is significant. We think the northeastern United States is going to have huge new opportunity as a result of warming. And the issue isn't that the nighttime highs have gotten so much higher. The nighttime lows have gotten much higher. We've been able to introduce winter canola way into Quebec and in the Finger Lake area as a whole new crop, and it's working marvelously. We're only in the third year, but it's worked extremely well each time, and that's probably a low-hanging fruit. In July of this year, we're going to get the key leadership in USDA and Ag Canada together back in Syracuse to lay out a strategy of how that region can take advantage of some of the weather variability and particularly the nighttime low. So that's just another collaboration. John Deere has brought in 4 states and University of Guelph to do business in a new way. They want to experiment. They didn't want to work with all the universities. They picked the states. I did a facilitation last week, and they're looking at new applications that are just unbelievable in terms of the impact that it would have on production agriculture, and at some point all states will be able to play. Building collaborations is not easy, Ken. I had an opportunity to introduce key executives from an animal health company to my host institution in Wisconsin, and the key scientists there didn't like the private sector, didn't want to come. And long story short, we got them at the meeting, and it's turned out wonderful. And as a result, this health company has made substantial investments in about 6 of the land-grant institutions in our region and has started a new company called ChemGen. And that company is creating new jobs and producing products that will result in substantial feed efficiency for ruminants, and it actually reduces methanation too. So that's a couple examples of collaborations, Ken. And I think what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Doug. And